pleasure for me to be here. I am going to continue a little bit of Angelo's story with an episode that I'll be reading. But I wanted to talk also a bit about how I, a Norwegian, came to have any involvement in the project at all. And in truth, I owe it to someone who was mentioned to you earlier this evening, Laura Janata, who was here from the Public Relations Department at Roosevelt University, called me one day at my office in the Academic Success Center and said that someone had approached her who had a manuscript of his experience as a student at Roosevelt, and would I be willing to look at the manuscript and write a potential blurb for the text. So I, of course, said yes, and then met with Nikos and had the opportunity to read the book in manuscript and realized immediately that I was not the person who should be writing this blurb. Because the book chronicled this experience of a student at Roosevelt from the absolute opposite point of the perspective picture that our former president, President Emeritus Ralph Weil, had written in his book, which is called Through These Thresholds, or Through These Portals. Thresholds is my book. At any rate, so I was thinking, you know, Ralph's book is the way the institution was in the 1960s and looking at it from the macrocosmic view. And Nico's book is what it was like to be enrolled from the microcosmic view, essentially telling the same story in the same time frame. And so I spoke to Laura and said, could you call Ralph? Which she did, and Professor Weil did write a blurb for the cover of the book. And then, well, I wasn't going to stop reading at this point. And so I had to continue with my quest, and then actually asked if I could see out of Arcadia as well, so I would get the full arc and the whole narrative to this point. I'm also expecting a sequel. I think things happen in 3, so I don't want to put the burden upon you, but a trilogy would look good on my bookshelf. So, I read both books, and then what took me so much about this book in particular was the way in which, in a very particularized and very specific narrative about one character, it represented the experience of so many of the members of the student body who, to borrow Ralph's phrase, had gone through those portholes. Myself included. Here I am, the son of a farmer from Minnesota who gave up farming in his 40s in order to relocate to Chicago with the dream of being a lyricist for big bands, because that's where WGN Clear Radio was broadcast from. And my trip was just from Humboldt Park on what we now call the Blue Line to Washington, or to the Randolph Station, and then a short walk to Roosevelt University. So my journey was shorter, but my adventure was the same. And by attending that university, like so many of the students that I've worked with since returning, I continually encounter the story that's chronicled in this book, and that's a big part of the excitement. I mean, there are, and I told Nikos already, I think a half-dozen names of students whose particulars are different, but whose journey is the same. And to have that recorded and held in my hands was, for me, a very exciting experience. Someday, you should stop into the Artist Snack Shop next to Roosevelt and talk to the nephew of the owner, who I recently connected Nikos with, who is a Roosevelt graduate and tells the story of his experience at the university and the family quest which brought him there. Just down the street, there is Demetrius, who now runs the Safeway franchise and takes people on tours of the Museum Park and Grant Park, who is a former student of mine, a tutor of mine, who came from Ithaca and ventured as a mathematics major to also be a very enterprising fellow. Worked as a busboy just down the street when it existed at the, what is it, of Klamka? The courtyards of Klamka. And then came to school during the day. other students that I have known and can think of only took classes in the evening, 6 o'clock in the evening and on Saturdays, because the other 5 days a week, the one in particular I have in mind, cleaned 18 rooms in the Drake Hotel before coming to class. Angelo similarly has that kind of student experience and transcends it in order to go forward into that sequel, that third book that I'm anticipating. And so that quality is what excited me about the book initially and what made me pass it on to Ralph Weil. And then what else held me is the portrait of the city of Chicago in the early 1960s that the book makes available. And it ranges from the lower reaches of Rush Street and the Billy Goat's Cafe or Tavern to the pinnacle of it, what that time was the tallest building in the city, the top of the rock in the Prudential Building, just above the base relief of the Pillars of Hercules there on the front of the building. And then the narrative continues to unfold. It takes you from Billy Goat's to the top of the rock and from the lakefront all the way to the western limits of the city along the streets of Columbus Park. And here is this tapestry, and along the way you see the places which Angelo passes on a regular basis. You can take the tour. You can walk down Michigan Avenue, past what at one time was Stuart Brent Books, make the turn at the Water Tower Place, and within 2 blocks be at the YMCA. The places that are mentioned in the book still exist, and many of the places that are mentioned in the book have ceased to exist, but still live very deeply in memory of anyone who was a part of Chicago at the time. And then the next tapestry that the book also introduces is the historical context within which these events were taken. So you're given the debates, the Nixon and Kennedy debate. We're missing the current one, perhaps, right at this moment, but you don't have to watch that. You can read what it was really like when the debates were established. Howard Case. And then there is the movement in historical time from his arrival in the States with vignettes, little bits of the Cuban Missile Crisis, celebrating its, 50th anniversary. I don't know if it's a thing you celebrate. But anyway, it's mentioned in the book, and it's part of the tapestry of the book. So it's the experience of Roosevelt University, it's the experience of the landscape of Chicago, and it's an avenue into the historical context within which the events are represented. And it was those several things happening simultaneously within the story of a single individual struggling to find this adventure in a new world, this personal odyssey. Those were the elements that captivated me about the book. And the passage that I have to read, that is what I do at this point, correct? Okay, good. Is Angelo having a financial problem with that technical institute set up to bring people here under relatively false pretexts, and then be charged for the privilege. And Angelo has led a minor rebellion, caused the other students to quit and leave the campus, and gone off to Roosevelt University, only to be followed by a bill collector. And he has, fortunately, a patron who helped him come to the United States in the first place, who he now needs to meet for the first time. And that's the passage that I have for you. "You made it," the secretary said. "I wondered if you would." Angelo grinned. "I'm here. Mr. Passos will be with you shortly." "Thank you." She picked up her phone, pushed a buzzer at the side of her desk, and mumbled something over the receiver. Then she opened a door and offered Angelo a seat in a thickly carpeted, spacious room. At the sides of a glass cabinet stocked with tan binders, an American and and a Greek flag stood in opposite corners of the room.